What is wrong with people? It now says this webinar is being live streamed. I can't hear you. I know what you're doing. You're making sure I can read.
Now we're starting the webinar, so we'll be bringing people into the room. Just give us a moment.
All right. Well, just so we're clear, I could read before any of you were born. And you can pass that on to Sylvan Adams if you want. Dopey prick that he is. Anyway, where were we? Hello, Sarah. I know you're our leader, our glorious leader for this webinar.
I would say a moderator more than
Moderator,
anything.
okay.
Yes. But I think yeah, the attendees are still funneling in. We're at 1:30. There are over 500 people that registered. So
Whoopee. Well, hello to all you 500 webinars.
And
this is exciting. I mean, I haven't been to Canada for a while. So I'm happy to come even on a webinar is good. Okay.
It was very exciting for us.
I won't say hello to everyone I know at Dogwood and in Wet'suwet'en and all over all those gas pipelines that the man is digging through our wonderful world, because I don't have to. I've already said hello to all of them. So, shall we?
Shall we get started then?
Yes, let's do it.
Perfect. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our panel, Student Over Donor Money, the Suppression of Palestine Solidarity at McGill University and Beyond. I would just, before I get started, with great gratitude, I want to extend my thanks to the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, Just Peace Advocacy, Palestine and Jewish Unity, and other organizations for helping us coordinate and endorsing this very timely event. I'm Professor Sara Farhan. I'm a historian of the modern Middle East. I'm originally from Iraq, but I'm currently working and teaching in British Columbia. I have the honor of moderating a panel composed of brilliant young scholars and activists, world-renowned legal scholar, and of course, the inspirational, incredibly talented, and admirable Roger Waters, who, like I said, I remember in my third-year course, Culture and Counterculture in Europe, we studied your lyrics as a counter-revolutionary movement. So it's a great honor, a privilege to be sharing this digital airspace with you. Today, Roger Waters and students from McGill, as well as other students and advocates from campuses around Canada, are joining together to push back against donor and donor influences and their attempt to thwart Palestinian solidarity on campus. First, I just want to emphasize that the Coalition de Résistance pour l'Unité Étudiante Syndicale, or CRUS, mobilized for students' strike in solidarity with Palestine as of November 1st and the 22nd as well, so today and tomorrow. A total of 45,000 students, and of course more to come, will be striking in solidarity for Palestine in Quebec. I want to emphasize that this is actually, the general strike is only the first step of their campaign to put pressure on their institutions, on their education institutions, but also on corporations, the Quebec province of Quebec government, as well as the federal government, to sever ties with Israel. So obviously, we'd like to dedicate this online panel to the striking students in Quebec and thank them for being the beacon of light in these dark times. Quebec, of course, has a long history of student-led activism, student-led solidarity that has a ripple effect across Canada, and it's incredible to see that continuity today. Another quick emphasis, yesterday it was announced that York University in Canada, the Faculty Association, voted for BDS. They'll be joining a long list or an increasing list of faculty associations across Canada, severing ties, both financial and research ties with institutions or corporations that are collaborating with directly or indirectly with Israel. This is, of course, includes University of Windsor and Memorial University in Newfoundland, as well as Saskatchewan, amongst others. So it's great to see this list grow. Having said that, the influence of mega donors on universities in Canada continues to reflect a profound shift in the governance and priorities in higher education institutes, where philanthropic contributions are often leveraged to reshaping curricula, direct research agendas, and bolster administrative strategies. This is a larger trend, a more concern in the United States, but we are feeling the influence here in Canada. Even though our tuitions are subsidized by taxpayers, we're still seeing the influence of mega donors on overall policies in universities. While framed as an altruistic investment and in knowledge and innovation, these donations frequently serve to entrench the ideological and economic preference of the ultra-wealthy. Tax incentives amplify this dynamic, allowing mega donors to claim substantial deductions while dictating the intellectual and institutional direction of ostensibly public-serving universities. The system exacerbates economic inequality while donors enjoy public subsidies for their private influences that are rooted in political dynamics, as we're seeing, of course, right now with the influence on McGill. So this is the atmosphere that we're in right now. And this is the part of the challenges that our student activists are facing. Not only are they trying to get an administration that is highly unaware and out of touch with reality, to listen to them, to echo their sentiments, to at least sit on the table and discuss their concerns. But there's also an external force that is at play here that they're also challenging. And it is my pleasure to introduce Roger Waters to begin our panel discussion. So we're joined with Roger Waters, musician and activist. I will give you the platform now. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. All right, so what's happened today so far is the ICC has issued now the arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and his co-genocider, what is now Yov, is that his name, Gallant. Those two archdevils from the state of Israel. So that is this is a monumental morning for all of those of us in this resistance movement. We're resisting everything that you were describing, that the cretinous Sylvan Adams is involved in. I was fascinated as well this morning. Karen Rodman sent me yet another WhatsApp or something he'd posted somewhere, where with pictures of old versions of Pink Floyd, where he purports to know what the history of Pink Floyd is, A, B, what it was all about when I was in the band anyway, because when I was in Pink Floyd, it actually was part of a revolutionary movement, although possibly Gilmore and Rick had no idea that that was going on. It was happening around them without them understanding. Nicky, my friend Nick Mason, I think he got it a little bit, but the other two had no idea what was going on. So we were always hoping to be part of a revolutionary movement. That is what the lyrics of the song Echoes are all about. Strangers passing in the street, by chance two passing glances meet, and I am you and what I see is me. It's fundamental to everything I wrote and all the music I made when I was in Pink Floyd and everything that I've done since. And it's fundamental for me being with all of you here on this webinar this morning. Okay, it was fundamental to me standing outside that courthouse with Phil Fontaine in 2018 in our joint people's fight against Chevron Corporation, which I'm still engaged in, obviously, because none of this shit ever goes away. But what lightens my load and what lifts my heart is to see the students at McGill and York and all the other universities all over Canada and all over the United States and all over the world, in fact, standing up to the media machine that is trying to convince us that Israel has a right to defend itself. What a joke. Yeah, of course it does, if that's what Israel did, but it doesn't. What Israel is doing is stealing land from the indigenous people of Palestine, okay, and doing anything that they can to get the indigenous people of Palestine to leave the land so they can build golf courses for Donald Trump with nice seaside views from posh apartments. You know, when they've cleared the rubble and all the dead bodies of all the dead babies away from Gaza, when they get to the end of what they think they're going to get to the end to. I watched my friend Bassan on her latest post. In fact, I answered her post this morning on Twitter, 6 3/4 minutes of this brave young woman bearing her soul to us as she does almost every day, and I watch it every day as well, and I send her my love as often as I can and my support, and I'm so happy and so proud of the students at McGill who are standing up to these arseholes in a battle that, as I have described it, is an existential battle for the soul of the human race. There are fundamental questions, although I'll mention 2 maybe, or 3. We have to decide whether or not we support the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from Paris in December the 10th, 1948, 30 articles. That's question 1. Sylvan Adams does not. All right. Well, actually, that's kind of, that's almost enough. Everything else extrapolates from that basic question. After the Second World War, all the winners in that fight agreed to the setting up of the United Nations, and they agreed to the basic principle that all our brothers and sisters all over the world, irrespective of their ethnicity or their religion or their nationality, have certain basic human rights. Those include religious rights and political rights and civil rights. Do we subscribe to that principle and to that international law or not? Sylvan Adams doesn't. I do. Those 2 ladies who I spoke to in Vancouver in 2000, whenever I was 17 there, in that lovely church, to all those lovely people, and they know who the people who were there will remember this. There was one young Muslim woman and an older lady who was from Independent Jewish Voices, I think she was from Independent. Yeah, she is. I checked her out the other day. She's dead now, but I'm so glad I had the conversation with her. She was a wonderful woman, and everybody in that room understood what I am saying now. So I'll shut up because we've only got an hour and a half or something, and I know a lot of other people will have things to say. You know, please don't tell me which concert you went to, or ask questions about Pink Floyd, but because really I am here to share my love for all of you, and hopefully we can all agree that the only things that matter in our lives are love and truth, none of which you will find in the arch prick Sylvan Adams, no matter how much money he has donated to McGill University. All right, I'll shut up. Boom, I'm done.
Thank you so much. And feel free to jump in whenever you feel inclined. I don't want to make this very rigid, but I'd like to pass on the platform next to McGill students and alumni. First, we have Yasmin, a recent SPHR alumni from McGill. And I believe that you were involved in SPHR as of 2022, and you spoke virtually to Roger, so you have a connection prior to that. And joining Yasmin is Jay, who is an education student at McGill and an organizer. Thank you both for joining us. I know that you want to be out in the streets and joining your colleagues and comrades, so we really appreciate you taking time to join us today for the panel.
Yeah, hi everyone. Can you hear me well? I'm just making sure, okay. Hello, everyone. Hi, Roger. It's nice to talk again. I know a lot of people are excited that you're interested in the context on our campus. I've been around for a little longer, so I had to tell them that this wasn't the first time, but it's always exciting. So yeah, I mean, Jay is basically obsessed with Sylvan Adams in a very unique way. So I'll let Jay do the bulk of the work or the talking on Sylvan. But I guess I can give a brief overview of the developments at McGill, where we've seen donor pressure be very explicit, and McGill's repression. So SPHR has basically been on campus for the last 2 decades. It came out of the Netanyahu riots in 2002, where students across Montreal basically rioted to protest Netanyahu's visit at Concordia University. And then following that, like huge momentum, there was a really huge crackdown on campuses against anything related to the Middle East. And so we see like a decade-long hiatus before things pick up again in around 2014. And for the next few years after, we see SPHR kind of run a very awareness-raising campaign, very institutional, very important, but not necessarily directly confrontational. And there were a lot of efforts to repress those institutional campaigns at the time. We hear from like people like Trudeau or like the immigration prime minister that they're disgusted to be alumni of such a university due to mobilizations around BDS. And so we kind of see this trend follow for around 5 years until October 7, which I think changed the landscape for most of us across different campuses. And so suddenly we were kind of confronted with a base of students that wasn't just a few hundred, but several thousands who were extremely pissed off at our university's complicity in the genocide they were seeing unfold. And so it was the strategies that Palestine organizing took on were very different. And with a large base, you could be a lot more confrontational and a lot more bold. And you could be and you can act on the offensive and no longer be on the defensive. And so that was, I think October 7 changed a lot for us. And so we see these students shut down entire faculties that are complicit in some way or another in the genocide that we're seeing unfold in Palestine. We see pickets come up across the semester. We see students take over buildings, walk through buildings on campus, just taking up as much space as possible. And we also see the political line be raised to a much higher degree than we could have supported or championed before. And so that was a really important development post October 7. And then we see the encampment set up around the summer. And that was also, I think, a major shift within the movement because it allowed us to connect to networks in the city that we were previously isolated from. And so McGill kind of gets this reputation for being very insular within the Montreal activist scene, which is a very legitimate concern. And we are like an Anglo elite institution within an overall Francophone city. So I think the encampment really served to connect us to wider networks and to engage with different struggles. And I think the community that came out of the encampment was probably its biggest success. And we also see a shift where McGill has suddenly become a target for the general public, which was something that we were trying to build towards. But we really did want to kind of highlight and spotlight McGill as a target that everyone should be furious about, and that and not feed into the administration's narrative about outside agitators, but to, I guess, welcome this new development where like everyone was pissed off at McGill and pissed off at Sylvan Adams and the kind of research and investments that McGill was invested in. So, and McGill did a really easy job at doing that. I mean, the repression against the students was honestly quite unfounded. It was unprecedented for McGill campus. We saw students and community members get tear gassed, brutalized for months. And we saw smear campaigns be launched against our administration where they called us where they basically called us terrorists, said they've reported us to federal authorities and that we're a national security concern. So yeah, the McGill admins PR has taken a bit of a shift. I don't think they're letting Saini speak anymore, which is really funny and interesting. But in regards to Sylvan Adams, so that project is projected to be completed this semester. We've seen students targeted on multiple occasions. Students have been arrested on the site. On October 7th, students vandalized the building. And in terms of how we've seen donor pressure materialize on campus, we have done a lot of access to information requests where we've seen, I mean, most of what we get back is like nefariously blacked out. But what we're able to make out from what we're provided is that McGill's response and McGill's repression is almost verbatim implemented by consulting the recommendations of external donors. So when it comes to disciplining students who are part of the
Can I
encampment-
interrupt, please?
Yes, you can.
This is way, way, way too long. Okay, this can seem scientific. I love you. I think everything you're saying, I couldn't agree with you more. But it's way too detailed about your domestic narrative about
Totally.
McGill is being targeted by you and others because it refuses to divest from the state of Israel. Is that broadly correct?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, good. Okay, good. But that's extremely important. The details of who and what and why and when are less important because we've got an hour and a half here or a bit more than that or whatever it is. So and we want to hear lots of people to speak. So I love your speech. It's great. You've informed me, but it's too detailed and it's going on too long. Could you wrap it up and so we can get on with the rest of it?
I mean, I think Jamie can elaborate a little bit more about
We
Sylvan
don't need
Adams.
more elaboration. We need to move on, but I want to hear what Jim has to say. And okay, I'll shut up now. And please, I apologize for interrupting you, but we need to move on.
That's all right. That's all right. Jamie, if you could pick it up, that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah, sure. I'll make it quick in that case. So yeah, as Yasmin aptly pointed out, I am a student in the faculty where Sylvan Adams made his landmark donation, which was the largest ever to a faculty of education in Canada. So let's just talk a bit about who Sylvan Adams is. He was born in Quebec. His father was a Holocaust survivor. He's a billionaire. So as Sarah mentioned off the top, there's a concerning trend in universities where private donorship is taking over the interests of public institutions. At age 57, he moved to Israel. So here's the thing. He is essentially a very wealthy man who is obsessed with cycling and participates. He tours the world participating in these cycling events that rich people can pay to participate in so they can feel like they're athletes. And while he does that, he's very transparent about his goal of spreading the word that the so-called state of Israel, which is an apartheid state, is open to the world for business. And he calls this sports philanthropy. We call it sports washing because he is sports washing genocide. And during that time, he opened up the institute that Yasmin mentioned that's been under construction at McGill, the very important piece of information here is that it has a partnership with Tel Aviv University. So in the Palestinian movement, the large calls are for divestment, as Roger mentioned, but also for academic boycott. So to end permanent partnerships with universities built on stolen land that are enforcing apartheid. Of course, McGill is also built on stolen land, and there is a lot of work being done around that right now. And so now, I mean, okay, the one thing I think that is very important to understand and that provided the context for this call is that Adams he's been very camera shy in the past, but he has quite a fragile ego. And he spoke on this podcast that I don't think anyone had ever heard of. I don't know how you found it, Roger, but the Canadian Jewish News podcast. And he brought up this fantasy he has about, in his words, kind of healing the south of the apartheid state of Israel by having this concert of his favorite bands. And so during that podcast, so of course, he invoked your name, Roger, but he also mentioned he admitted to just like interfering in the university's ways of disciplining students, pushing for student expulsion for political reasons, as well as just saying don't divest. And of course, the university is currently implementing austerity measures, so it is very tight on money and needs the donors' money. So he's exercising that power. And I do commend Roger for fighting him in the media because I think it's made him extremely insecure. He's made more media appearances in the last few weeks than he did in the year prior. But during that time, he has been on interviews saying things like the IDF needs to finish the job in Gaza, saying that all Palestinians killed, which is hundreds of thousands by any reasonable estimate, are terrorists. And that's a term he can't define because if he did, of course, if he defined his definition of terrorist, it would be any Palestinian who lays claim to their land, which is protected under international humanitarian law. And so just locally on the ground here, really quick, we do have a responsibility to make sure that this institution is organized against and that we do not normalize. We have to disrupt in all universities. And this is at the core of the Palestinian movement. We have to disrupt in all universities the normalization of accepting blood money to fund our research, especially for research as pointless as elite, athletic, whatever they're researching at his institutes. But that being said, there's no research that justifies taking any blood money, let alone do that on land of indigenous people of Turtle Island who are still experiencing their own genocide, particularly here in Montreal, the Kanien'kehá:ka people. It's a violation of everyone's humanity to have this institute in the city. And Sylvan is simply hell-bent on kind of exercising his power over McGill students and the broader Montreal community. So that kind of gives you an idea of what's going on right now. I hope that was
That was perfect, Jim. Thank you for all of that. Sylvan Adams is actually a huge help to us because we believe in human rights and Sylvan Adams doesn't. I know I said this before and I will probably keep repeating it. And hearing you talking about McGill, I've been for many years living in United States, quite close to New York. So I know a bit more about Colombia than I do about McGill, in fact, quite a lot more. But this is a model that is going on all over North America, in Canada and the United States of America, and all over Europe as well. You know, I have people who have been in prison for demonstrating in Germany, in England, where this is an international problem that we face. Let us not forget that there was a new woman. Her name is Nicola or Nicole. I retweeted something. She was arrested in the island of Jersey, which is the British Channel Islands. So she is joined to the list of Asa Winstanley and Sarah Wilkinson and Medhurst and blah, blah. The other journalists have been arrested under Section 12 of the terrorist bill in the United Kingdom, where under Keir Starmer, under the new Nazi Labour government, they have now changed the laws so that they can, so it's against the law to protest the genocide in Palestine. It's against the law, as it is. It's against the law in France. It's against the law in Germany. So what we're talking about with you guys at McGill is them making it against the law. This is what they're attempting to do. That's why your resistance to this, obviously, is as important as it is. It's fundamentally important. The good thing about somebody like Sylvan Adams is he's an idiot. He's probably got an IQ hovering just below room temperature. I mean, his arguments make absolutely no sense at all. All the talk about Pink Floyd, which has attracted some of the attention, thank goodness, to this lunatic, is good for us. Okay, but we shouldn't waste too much breath on Sylvan Adams because he's already condemned himself with his daft TikToks and his podcasts and his absurd pronouncements. But what he's done actually is shine a light on the evil, unpleasant fact that if you donate $30 million to an institute like McGill, you can tell, what's his name, Steen, I can't remember, but the dean of the university, tell him what his policy needs to be as far as people like you who are resisting the removal from all of our lives of a moral compass. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to tear up international law. They're trying to say the ICG doesn't matter. They're trying to disband the ICC, which has now issued the arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant. And they're trying to say that we do not want a rule of international law. We're not interested in the United Nations. We're not interested in the idea that human beings can collaborate one with another to make life for all of us tolerable on this beautiful planet that we call home. I'm generalizing a bit, and I don't want to take up too much time anyway, but F. Sylvan Adams, he is a complete nobody, except he's made a few quid, and he uses it to buy influence, and that is what we're all fighting against. I'll shut up again. But Jim, thank you for your contribution. It was very informative for me.
Thank you all very much. Next up, we have Nikita, who is an organizer at Memorial University in Newfoundland, and an organizer for the MUN Students for Palestine. So go ahead, Nikita. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, everyone. So I'll just briefly summarize what's been going on our campus. It really relates back to the same kind of themes. We began an outdoor encampment in May of last year in June as we tried to hold a teach-in on indivisible feminism inside our admin building during regular hours. They tried to illegitimately remove us. We refused to leave, and then we did indoor encampment after that. So for about 50 days, our encampment lasted, with about a month of that inside the administration building. Our indoor encampment led to a promising meeting with 3 upper admin, in which several commitments were made, including a joint public statement, bursaries and supports for Palestinian students, and disclosure. They also agreed to facilitate a meeting with the Board of Regents to present on divestment. However, after that meeting with the board, these administrators would change their trajectory. These commitments would go on to be partially fulfilled, grossly misrepresented, or entirely abandoned. MUN did disclose, and now we know they have over $15 million invested in companies, some of which are explicitly included in a UN list, where they state that they're cautioning companies and investors on the risk of complicity in war crimes. On June 18th, we presented to the Board of Regents Finance Committee. The chair of the board's disdain for student protesters was palpable in that meeting, palpable. But it was made even more clear by emails he forwarded in the week following. On July 4th, we broke a story about the chair of the board's privacy breach related to those emails. And the next night, without any prior notice of trespass or police, despite open lines of communication with the university, police came, dismantled our encampment, and arrested 3 protesters, including myself. The following week, the same chair, under an active investigation related to the protest, was allowed to, without declaring a conflict of interest, chair the meeting in which the board made sweeping decisions to reject all divestment calls. The chair was subsequently removed because of public pressure over the privacy breach, but the illegitimacy of the divestment vote has yet to be revisited. It's worth noting, and that's the connection to all of this, that this chair was appointed by our government, has close ties to a political party, which the current head of campus security and former chief of police had served as chief of staff for. From the university to the police, the Crown, the media, government oversight offices, it would be too much to recount all of the blatant lies, deleted or withheld records, discriminatory application of policies, and misused resources. This webinar focuses on donors and campus suppression. Memorial has a very modest list of donors, and from what we can tell initially, no significant Zionist lobby groups which influence them via donations. But what we do see are networks of privilege and power and political connections, and they appear to be mobilized to suppress the student movement. We see that, like other universities across the country, MUN is not led by the interests of their students or their faculty, but answers to something else. And I had some other things, so I'll leave it there because I know others have some important things to share.
Thank you so much, Nikita.
Can I comment on what she had to say? Because that's so important. What I've forgotten her name, or I mean,
Nikita.
What?
Nikita.
Nikita. What got to me was in your last 10 seconds or 15 seconds or so, you said this doesn't come from Zionist donors as far as you're particular university does, and you see this as a pattern as well in other universities, and whatever. That is so important, because we do have to understand, and I have to make this point, that imperialism and colonialism is part of the capitalist makeup of the way the planet is organized for the benefit of the very wealthy and to the detriment of ordinary people everywhere, and absolutely the poorest of our brothers and sisters all over the world. And so any institution is always subject to the influence of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and whoever your billionaires are all over Canada, the people building the pipelines and the people taking the toss, and the people who are doing all of that because they're feathering their nests and lining their pockets. That is why they try and silence the voices of people like you who believe in human rights, because you cannot have universal human rights and capitalism. It doesn't work. The whole idea of capitalism is that the people who control production are the people who own the capital. And this is a fundamentally undemocratic idea. Okay? And it is completely contrary to the idea of human rights. We could not have sailed the ocean blue along with Columbus and the Portuguese. This is the Brits I'm talking now. And plundered India and Australia and New Zealand, and the Portuguese couldn't have plundered Brazil, and the Spanish the whole of Central and South America, and obviously the Brits and a few others, North America, and murdered the entire, 90% of the indigenous population in North America. We couldn't have done that without the idea that we, white supremacists, have the right to kill indigenous people. This is what they're trying to sell us now in Israel, is that that the Israeli settlers, I'm not talking about Judaism, by the way. I'm not directing an attack against Jewish people. I, as is well known, do not have an anti-Semitic bone in my body. I never did. And I know this because I live in this body. I know the feelings that go on here. I never ever think, oh, they're Jewish. Ooh, never. It's never ever crossed my mind about anyone ever. All right, so let's get that out of the way. But the model that we're being sold here is that it's okay for the settler colonialists in Palestine to murder the indigenous population and steal their olive trees and their goats and their houses and their bed linen and everything that they've built up over the thousands of years that they've been living there in relative peace and quiet. All right, so thank you for bringing that up. Neoliberal capitalism, capitalism period, which means plunder, invasion and plunder of foreign lands at the expense of the indigenous people, is central to this conversation. It's not just Zionism.
This is why universities like NYU is making Zionism a protected status and conflating it with Judaism. It's actually more harmful for Jewish students than ever because of this deliberate conflation. So next, I'd like to pass it on to Zach Snowden, who is a graduate student at UMBC, doing a master's thesis investigating political mobilization of the working class for sustainability through an eco-socialist lens. He did his undergrad at TMU in politics with a minor in sustainable studies, and hopes to someday bring together educational and professional experience to start an eco-socialist party in Ontario and or Canada. Thank you very much for joining us, Zach. Go ahead.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here talking to you from lately to Nederland. My experience at UNBC is going to be much different than a few of the other speakers. It's a tiny school, but I think what it kind of represents is the culture of silence that goes into stopping a lot of these things before it gets to the open repression. Because it's so small, my goal was just to put together a solidarity and educational event, like a pub night, associating, the Palestine issue with the Irish issue. It was a Irish pub night for Palestine. I have a bunch of student speakers in to make those connections for people. It was a great time, but leading into it, I went to ask my dean. I said, well, we need an extra security guard. Can we get some funding for this? And she says, the best I can do for you is pretend that this conversation never happened. And immediately there's cold water thrown on it, right? And then, everything is going smoothly. And then a week before the event, I get 10 minutes notice and I'm hauled into a meeting with the university's risk officer where I'm grilled for an hour because I'm raising money for terrorism. It was, we were raising money for the UNRWA. And we were so careful. We put on our poster the quote from the minister, Rob Oliphant, that he had spoken to a constituent, a couple weeks earlier, and had been sort of caught on hot mic saying, the only way to get money into Gaza is through the UNRWA, and any other organization that we fund is going to go through the UNRWA anyway. And we put that right on our promotional flyer, and they still haul me in, and they're grilling me over this. Serendipitously, during that meeting, the news came out that Canada was refunding the UNRWA. And so after about 40 minutes, somebody in the corner was like, hey, so maybe this will help your conversation, but this just happened. And so immediately they flip and they say, actually, it's about safety. And because they had a call in from a local sort of Zionist organization leader who has it's a big local drama, has had like a diversity and inclusion director at Northern Health was fired for her work in the art scene because this guy called in. It's a whole thing. But this guy called in screaming at the staff to the point where they felt threatened. And that was on us somehow, that this guy was threatening UNBC staff. It was a big problem. And then during the course of this, they say, oh, we have to hire all this extra security, which they ended up doing. They hired a private army, shut down an entire wing of the school for us to like the finale of the event was that we all did group karaoke to sing Irish resistance songs together. Like this is the kind of event this was. And they had to hire a private army, and have everybody sign a waiver saying if you get jumped by Zionists on your way home, it's not our fault. We're not liable. So it was just sort of implicit intimidation and sort of slow walking and sort of pushing back on the process the entire way through. And this does, I think, go back to what Nikita and Roger were talking about just a second ago, that it's not necessarily like when you have a big Zionist donor that's putting pressure, that is going to make a huge difference. But UNBC, as small as it is we're up in the foothills of northern BC, but we do a lot of work in mining. Like that's where a lot of the money that comes through our university goes, is for extractive industry, forestry, and mining. My faculty is natural resources and environmental studies. So they've unified human geography with fracking research. And these things are done very intentionally. And it's all part of the same process of moving in silence to sort of prevent things from being spoken about or moving before they ever get to that point. So yeah, I just think it's an interesting contrast to the larger universities where you've had these big encampments and things. We can't do encampments here. It gets cold really early in the season. But it still is a very interesting process trying to do anything. So that was my experience.
Thank you so much, Zach.
Very good.
Yeah.
Bravo. He makes me regret one thing, and I may change that in a minute. I'm not wearing my cafe, one of my many cafes, and I should be because I'm on the telly. And I think it's great that they are, and I should be too, because this is one of the things that we can do, is because the cafe is now an absolute symbol of our belief in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and our support for the indigenous people of Palestine specifically, but this support extends beyond that to our support for indigenous people everywhere, including in Canada, and including all the battles that are going on with the pipelines in British Columbia and other places. And so good for you, my friend, and thank you for that succinct description of what's going on in your neck of the woods. And I'm glad you've got a cafe around your neck of the woods. Good for you, my brother.
Thank you both so much. I'd like to pass it on now to Professor Seeley Harrington, who is an associate professor and chair of equity law at the University of Windsor, Faculty of Law. Please go ahead, Josh.
It's a real pleasure to speak on this panel about the conflict between donor influence and reprisal against Palestine solidarity. And it is a pleasure especially to be speaking to you about Palestinian liberation on the day the International Criminal Court issued tragically overdue arrest warrants against Israeli leaders for their war crimes and crimes against humanity, which we have unbearably witnessed live streamed over the past year. I'm currently an associate professor and the chair of equality law at the University of Windsor, which is currently facing an onslaught of donor pressure for its historic BDS agreement with our brave student activists. But I was, until recently, an assistant professor at the Lincoln Alexander School of Law at Toronto Metropolitan University, which was arguably the worst site of reprisal against student activism for Palestine in Canada. 1/6 of the student body was threatened with expulsion, and not even for setting up an encampment, which, to be clear, is a legitimate form of protest. No, at TMU Law, students faced a 6-month anti-Semitism inquisition because they wrote a letter that dared to criticize the dean's appalling neutrality on Israel's occupation, apartheid, and genocide in Gaza. At any university, such reprisal would have been shameful since it is antithetical to critical inquiry. Censorship is, after all, the opposite of dialogue. But at TMU Law, the reprisal was also deeply hypocritical. TMU Law is an institution that specifically marketed itself as a safe haven for social justice advocacy, with explicit branding, inviting students with grit and a passion for racial justice to challenge the status quo. Consequently, TMU's clumsy and disproportionate response to valid political expression was not only anti-intellectual, but anti-Palestinian, in direct contradiction with the university's supposed commitments to academic inquiry and racial justice. I will briefly outline 2 things. First, a description of the reprisal and exoneration of Palestine activists at TMU. I think it's very important for student activists to hear about these types of exonerations to understand the boundaries of their advocacy and what walls to push against. And second, how the reprisal we are seeing across North America against Palestine solidarity is undoubtedly connected to the corporatization of the university. We have seen universities across the continent crack down on Palestine solidarity, just as we have seen corporations crack down on that solidarity. And the reason for this alignment is obvious, because universities are being governed like corporations. As such, the question of Palestine transcends Palestine itself. We must, of course, remain focused in our advocacy to stop the genocide in Gaza, while also relating to our comrades in a manner that makes that advocacy sustainable. But Palestine has also, like a canary in a coal mine, evocatively illustrated the corporate capture of the university. So while my focus is on unfreedom in Palestine, we are also confronting unfreedom across Canadian society. First, what happened at TMU Law? Students confronted with an institution wielding racially coded invective like terrorism, while remaining pathetically silent about the far greater violence of occupation, wrote a letter to the dean declaring their solidarity with Palestine, its liberation, and yes, even its resistance. The dean denounced them as anti-Semitic terror supporters, while they were called literal terrorists in national media. And after a 6-month investigation commissioned by the university itself, the students were completely exonerated. They were not anti-Semitic, and their political expression was permissible. The investigator even criticized the dean for rushing to judgment against these vulnerable students for good measure. But why was the administration so ham-fisted in its response. In the context of public underfunding of post-secondary education, cowardly and opportunistic administrations sacrifice academic freedom at the altar of private overfunding. And while I can only speculate about what was in the minds of the TMU administrators, specifically, the chronology lies in plain sight. The students sent their anti-Zionist letter. Zionist mega donors expressed outrage. Within days, the students were denounced, parroting language indistinguishable from Zionist propaganda. And within a month, the students were investigated on the basis of that same propaganda. And this propaganda prescribes an utter absurdity, namely that solidarity with Palestine is motivated not by opposition to Palestinian children as young as 5, saying they would prefer to die, not by 10 Palestinian children losing legs daily, not by 1,000 Palestinian children undergoing amputations without anesthesia, and not by what Britain's prestigious Lancet estimates is the death toll in Gaza as high as 200,000, with 70% of the victims being women and children. No, the surge of solidarity with Palestine across the globe is caused, they say, by anti-Semitism. The same so-called anti-Semitism that has apparently overtaken a majority of American Jews, 51% of whom think America should withhold arms from Israel, and 60% of whom support the formation of a Palestinian state. Identical policy prescriptions, I must note, to those listed in the TMU students' supposedly anti-Semitic letter. And the same so-called anti-Semitism that Zionists, from Canada to Israel, claim is the basis for this morning's overdue arrest warrants against Israeli leaders. The defamation of Palestine solidarity, or in this case, the rule of law, as anti-Semitic is deeply anti-intellectual. Why else, then, would it happen in a university of all places, at TMU, at UBC, at U of T, and here at McGill, if not for an anti-intellectual purpose? Just as Israel's impunity is too slowly, but still surely, eroding, the complicity of anti-Palestinian academic institutions is likewise confronting an unprecedented reckoning, with immense thanks to the courage and tenacity of student activism, which has demanded that very reckoning, including by students here on this panel. Let me say in no uncertain terms, these administrations are not pro-Jewish, they are pro-funding. And these donors are not virtuous, they are coercive, as they have clearly demonstrated by having the audacity to pull their supposedly unconditional donations, even when administrations severely punish their pro-Palestinian students, for not quite entirely crushing decolonial inquiry at the university, try as those administrators might. These donors, administrators, and the media can mislabel you as young, as naive, as confused or coerced by outside agitators, but what you really are is just, principled, and steadfast. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. Certainly not billionaires who you disagree with on capitalism, climate, borders, and every other facet of society they exploit to destroy not only Palestine, but this entire earth. The sooner these universities return to their academic mission, the sooner we will free Palestine and free ourselves. Thank you.
Bravo, bravo. After listening to that, I'm going to interject again. I sort of feel like quoting from one of my old records, which was called The Wall. And that is this: the evidence before the court, having just listened to the counsel here making his closing remarks, which is what they sounded like from a courtroom, the evidence before the court is incontrovertible. There is no need for the jury to retire. And that's how our argument, his argument, this guy, I've forgotten his name, but I thought that was great what he told us about TMU. Okay. What he says is clearly true, clearly irrefutable. All the evidence is there, the letters, the response to them, the name calling, the blah, blah, blah. So that was a perfect encapsulation of why we are meeting in this webinar today. So well done, my friend. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Seeley Harrington. And I think what we're getting is that the faculty is with the students. The students are on the right side of history, but we're all collectively against our mushrooming administration that is hemorrhaging funding and claiming that there's not enough money, and then going ahead and accepting donors, political influence. So what I'd like to do now is open the little time we have left to questions. And if we have any questions from the media, please go ahead and identify yourself and your affiliation so we can field your questions. For now, I will jump in we have a question for you, Roger. Some of our audience member wants to know how you became involved with Palestinian rights and how you became an advocate for Palestine.
I was doing a tour of Europe in 2006. I think it was the Dark Side of the Moon tour. This was in sort of the fledgling days of my being a solo performer. We're in the middle of the tour, and there's a gap, I think, between Istanbul and Athens, or between Moscow and something like that. Rog, there's a gap of 4 days here. We could stick in another gig. Be good. No, we can do it. All right, what is it? It's in Tel Aviv. All right, fuck it. Sorry, I used the F word there. I apologize. Anyway, and I thought no more about it, but shows where my head was at in 2006. Okay. So I started to get emails immediately. The gig sold out. It was in Highcombe Park football stadium. We sold out, I don't know, 70,000 tickets in a few minutes. Boom, gone. And I started getting emails saying, what are you doing? Do you not know that there's a new operation in Palestine called the BDS, which there was. It was nearly a year old at that time. And so I started to read something about it. And then I got the important email, which was from Omar Barghouti, who's now, he's an old friend of mine now, because from that moment on, we've been exchanging emails of all in. Anyway, I decided to cancel the gig in the football stadium built on Palestinian graves. But I came up with what I thought was a kind of compromise solution. And I still did a gig in Israel in 2006, but it was at a place, it was a sort of ecumenical agricultural establishment where Jews and Muslims and Druze and Christians and agnostics and atheists all live together and grow chickpeas, and their children all go to school. It's a peace village, also known as Wahat al-Salam, I believe. It's the name in Arabic. And I did this gig, and it was the biggest gig they ever had in Israel, or certainly at that time. There were about 60,000 people there. They went absolutely crazy with the show. They loved it. And at the end, there was a huge standing ovation until I picked up the mic and I said these words, I think. It is up to this generation of young Israelis to start to communicate with your neighbors and to make peace with the Palestinians and blah, blah, blah. And they went from, whoa, we love you, Pink Floyd, blah. They went, boom, to absolute silence. The shutters came down. And that was a deeply chilling moment. Anyway, I went back a year later, and I traveled all over the West Bank with a lovely woman who was working not for UNRWA, but the other one, the other UN thing called Allegra Pacheco. And we went everywhere. And so I drove in UN vehicles all over the West Bank, didn't go to Gaza, but everywhere else, with my jaw hanging on my chest, because I could not believe what I was seeing. In 2007, I was there going, and I went, wrote things on the wall and blah, 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 and there's film of all that. So that was the start of it. But seeing those teenage border guards at checkpoints all over the West, and all of those like piles of rocks across roads, and Allegra telling me, oh, by the way, this nice new kind of motorway that we're driving down, you're only allowed on it if you're Jewish. Well, how would they know that? You have a different colored number plate if you're Jewish. They have yellow number plates and everybody else has whatever. I said, I don't believe you. I mean, can you imagine you get in the car to drive down the I-95 from New York to Philadelphia, and there's somebody there going, excuse me, are you Christian? Well, you can't go on the road then if you're not. I mean, it's absurd, obviously. It's completely unacceptable from every, that was then. It's got worse and worse and worse and worse and worse ever since then. So I've been part of this movement. I was a Johnny-come-lately because in 2006, I can't remember how old I was, but I was already, you know, in my late 60s. So yeah, that's the answer to the question. That was my starting point. And my finishing point was writing back to Bassem in northern Gaza this morning on Twitter.
Thank you.
That's not the finishing point, because this fight will go on as long as there is a breath in my body. And I know that's true for everybody that I've heard speak on this webinar now. And I know we are growing. Our numbers are growing exponentially. And whoever it was, the first speaker, who I rather rudely cut short, but I believe it was her, who was talking about the growth of the movement. And since October the 7th, that's right, she brought up October the 7th. And she's quite right, because on or about October 7th and in the days that followed it, the mask came off. And it didn't need to come off Israel, because Israel, the mask was already up, but it came off the United States government and the UK government and the German government and the French government and the Italian government, and on and on and on. So they were there with their masks off going, excuse me, we don't believe in human rights. We believe in genocide. And that's what all these universities have been saying. Goaded as they've been with donations. I don't want to interrupt the flow, though, of this.
Yeah, I think you're right.
That answers that question.
Yeah, the liberal veneer has definitely peeled off, and the Palestine exception is now quite highlighted. We've always kind of known this, those of us who've been active before October 7th, but now it's quite bold. So the next question is actually for students. For those of us who are not in the academic ecosystem, how can we support student activism? And I guess it's a two-parter. And have you noticed a lull compared to the mobilization of students and now?
Is that for me again?
It's for the students, but feel free to chime in after we.
Okay, good. Yeah, let's hear.
Okay, Yasmin, do you want to hop in with me? Maybe we can do this together.
Yeah, for sure. We can do that. Sounds
Roger,
good.
don't cut her off this time. Let her finish.
Oh God.
Okay, well, I'll say really quick, I think after the encampments, there was a bit of a lull, just because it was very tiring and because the level of repression has really stepped up. And I think also there's just like, I mean, students, I can only speak to my case, but students do have to, in order to be able to continue to live, still be students. So they're still being, they have all their coursework expectations, which of course don't seem important at all in the context of a genocide. But then of course they're trying to make sure, in order to be able to organize on a university campus, you have to be able to be a student there. And so there's a lot of juggling going on, and then repression makes everything difficult in terms of organizing, right? Organizing has to move a little more underground, and that's difficult to do with anyone, but also when you've got young people learning how to organize. But Yasmin, I want you to hop in with your experience because you're on the ground all the time.
Yeah, for sure. I think Jay did a pretty good job at summarizing that. I think when it comes to students mobilizing, they're always facing like the internal procedures, whether it's like disciplinary charges or other things, and then also legal action, getting arrested for protesting. So I think it's really important for like outside community to show up and support. And I think it's also, we take it for granted that students are just going to be brave and put themselves on the line. But I think as like supporters, we need to step in and fill that role as well, and just be outraged that like these institutions exist in our neighborhood and are partially funded by our taxpayer money. And so, yeah.
Excellent. Would Nikita and Zach like to take the first part of the question, which is what can outside members who are not part of the academic ecosystem do to help student or support students in their activism?
Yeah, just really quickly, I think you know, the big movements to get universities to move on their commitments are important, and but there's a lot of institutional inertia there, and it's an uphill battle. One of the really important parts of student activism is changing the tone of the conversation in a broader sense, is normalizing these positions. And that's something that you don't need to be a student to do. You don't need to be on campus to do it. If you can educate yourself and equip yourself with the tools to talk about this with people in your life, in your family, that's important. That's a big deal. And you can take your lead from students on this, and it's a very good thing to do. Show up to student protests, learn from them there, because many of them have taken the time to learn and can teach you. But at the end of the day, the only way that we're going to get Canada to stop, sending those F-16 parts is if politically we can make it completely untenable to continue doing so. And that requires broad consensus across the sort of democratic partisan spectrum. So learning for yourself and being a thought leader in your own community is a big deal.
Excellent, thank you. We have a question about the oh, sorry, Nikita.
Sorry, I can also add to that. I know that Zach in their original piece talked about the weaponization of safety against students and the mischaracterization of protest and that being used to squash protest. And we've seen a lot of that. Just today, we got an ATIP request where we saw a log that the university kept of safety reports. And it's so egregious that they took rape and death threats that we received, that we were the victims of, and they logged them in a manner that made it look like we were threatening. And we see constantly that we struggle as students to get the truth out and to fight back against that misinformation. And often in the media, when we put a story out, they'll go get a statement from the university and they'll run that statement without fact checking it or asking for any proof of it. So something I would like to see from the broader community is really pushing back against those narratives when they see it, really asking for proof of those things, asking the university to be accountable for when they tell those lies. So that's something I would really like to see more from the public. And somebody in the chat mentioned as well, like pushing back against police repression on campus. That's something that the whole community can be doing. That's something that they can be writing their representatives about, and they can be writing the university about, because it affects them too.
Thanks, Nikita. This next question follows up, so maybe I'll pass it back to you. It's the accusation of anti-Semitism as the trump card in stopping and thwarting. What is the best response, and what do you think, in your experience, has been effective?
I don't know that I'm the best one to answer that. We can give it anecdotal stuff on our campus with that. Like, we have seen examples in that same ATIP, in that same document. We saw an example where a Jewish community member who's a supporter of a protest wrote in about harassment, and it was just logged as like noting anti-Semitic harassment. So it was seen as if it was against our protest when really it was a supporter of our protest. And we know that students and Jewish students and faculty and community members have repeatedly voiced concern over the conflation of criticism of the state of Israel with anti-Semitism. There might be somebody here with more experience with that to speak to it, though.
Can I comment on these briefly?
Please.
Yeah. So the question on student activism, I just want to say that a lot of the administrative and media and legal, public, private reprisal, a lot of what it's geared towards is deterrence and fracture. Mm-hmm. And so an important organizational consideration is the resiliency of the movement that you're organizing. And you all already know this, but I think it's good to like say out loud and just think about like what is the like political commitments that you're aligned around, so that when you face reprisal, you're still together, right? Like, what is your risk assessment? Like, who's willing to get arrested versus disciplined versus, right? Like, those are things you have to talk about and reach agreement about, so that you know how to respond in the moment to developments that are happening. I think it's really important for students to know the power that they wield in the university. Students are very powerful. I don't say this as in there's no power working against you, but we have seen over the past year the significance of the student movement in the context of Canadian discourse on Palestine. And the reason why there is such harsh reprisal is because administrations know that when this movement keeps building, it's something that they're going to really strain against, right?
Mhm.
Students in many ways, especially in the context of the underfunded university, are the purse of the university, right? They're the bank account. So you really do actually have a lot of power if you're coordinated. And then the last thing I'll say is escalation, right? Again, our focus is on ending the genocide in Gaza. It's very important to escalate, and because you have power, there are ways that you can do that, right? Censoring speech in the university, they try, but it's actually hard, right? It is hard for them to defend it and defend their integrity as an institution that is academic. Canadian universities are overwhelmingly public. FIPA everything, right? They have transparency obligations under law in Canada, right? So there's certain aspects of universities that are actually legally advantageous to student organizing, which is part of why you see so much of it. And then on the anti-Semitism smear, I think I'll just say quickly, if it is in the context of a formal process, like the discipline that my students experience over the past year, I think one of the strongest ways to respond is through asking basic questions about the allegation, right? Is through saying, on what definition of anti-Semitism? What part of the letter was anti-Semitic? What rationale makes it anti-Semitic? Because the thing is, that analysis in the context of the university constantly brings these institutions into irreconcilable contradiction, right? If they can call you anti-Semitic, and then when you say how, what definition, what analysis, if they present an analysis which is counter to the collective agreements that govern those universities, they are undeniably trying to censor student speech through unlawful means.
Mhm.
And so just basic questions actually I find quite effective. And if they're not willing to answer, that's because they're not willing to defend the allegation that they're trying to make, which is really what the whole smear tactic is about. In the context of informal settings, I think that the illustrating the breadth of the allegation that has been made, I find rhetorically powerful. So someone can say, well, you're anti-Semitic because you said X, Y, Z, right? And then you can say, so then the International Court of Justice is anti-Semitic. So then the International Criminal Court is anti-Semitic. So then the UN is anti-Semitic. So that the Jewish Holocaust, surviving, the son of Holocaust survivor documentarian at the Oscars is anti-Semitic, right? So that 61% of American Jews are anti-Semitic, right? Like all of these comparisons are important because I think the discrete argument people can get a bit fuzzy around, but when you illustrate the scale of the absurdity of the allegation as it is currently wielded, then yeah, the person has to come back and say, yes, I think the World Court is anti-Semitic. Okay. We clearly have different definitions and you should move on from this conversation. Those are my thoughts.
Just to kind of quickly piggyback on that, the Canada recently adopted the so-called handbook for IHRA, which includes criticism of Israel. So that is a little bit, concerning for me as an educator, someone who really interrogates the history of neo-Zionism, particularly in our discourse. But that is something that we also have to keep in mind, that just it is a handbook, and there are other governing definitions that we can refer to. The other thing in my experience, what I'm realizing is administration has no idea what Zionism is, has no idea what anti-Semitism is. And it is operating entirely on fear, on concern. And this is part of the playbook that they want to pass on, that intimidation onto the students, which is extremely concerning. We're seeing it even at small universities like here at UNBC. The other question that we want to jump into next is regarding CRA. I mean, we're seeing that happening with GPA's activism, but can we pressure CRA too? Canada has very few tax shelters options to minimize tax exposure. And I think that is in reference to donors specifically. So as our resident expert, I think we should start with you, Joshua. Our legal expert, I guess.
Yeah, not a tax expert, but I do think, you know, I haven't done research specifically on the CRA tactic, but it is another example where if you look at a basic analysis of how institutions are functioning, it's actually unlawful, right? And Zionism does a lot of the work of covering up the ways in which this illegality is so rampant and systematic. But there's been very good recent and successful advocacy. I forget the organization that led it. I know Independent Jewish Voices worked on it quite concertedly, but to attack the CRA, and Just Peace Advocates, I guess maybe it was them. But they've been doing really good work removing the charitable status from obviously uncharitable organizations that are like complicit in war crimes. So I think I do think that tactic is working and is illustrating the kind of rank illegality of a lot of these Zionist institutions. But I don't really have much specifics. But it is what I have seen and what I've read about it. It is a case where something is very obviously unlawfully happening, but because of Zionist hegemony, people have not reckoned with that illegality until repeatedly pressed about it. And I think what we've been seeing across North America is in part because of student activism, very forceful reckoning, right, based on the demands of students and demands of various other organizers.
Perfect, thank you. Maybe, Karen, do you want to add something about your expertise with CRA and exposure?
Sure. I mean, we're not here to talk too much about charities. There's lots of information on our website. There have been dozens of submissions, very detailed submissions made to the CRA around charities providing money to support the Israeli army, to support settlements, doing other things that are not allowed under the Income Tax Act, such as providing money to a foreign government, including many municipalities, including the municipality of Jerusalem. There was a report that Joshua mentioned, IJV jumped in with us on with Dr. Miles Howe that highlighted 5 of those, but those are just 5 of many, many that have been provided over the last few years to CRA. So just check justpeaceadvocates.ca website and check out any of the many letters and actions that you could take. And we have other webinars, and we can do other webinars on these. But certainly to expose this, to share that information, to understand it, to bring it to our tax regulators' attention is helping us to follow how the money is flowing. There's also articles that Dr. Miles Howe has done recently. I can put a link in a moment around some of what we've called the big gifters who through revocation access requests, we have verified that those, in fact, appear to be giving money to Israel, maybe on the surface in various forms, but in actual fact, it's more like money laundering, where the CRA has had a difficult time actually finding where the money has even gone. So I'll put that information in on a link. The 2 that have been revoked more recently, Jewish National Fund and Neiman, are a little different. They are more like policy decisions that have come out about not supporting the military, not supporting illegal settlements, and certainly the ICJ advisory decision and the UN resolutions and work towards ending the illegal occupation speak to the fact that the state of Canada is complicit if those actions aren't taken. So thanks for letting me jump in there.
Thank you. I'm going to lump in a few questions together because we're running out of time. We have a question from Carleton University Radio, CKCU, asking about what is the most effective way to pressure universities to divest. And another question from University of Hong Kong, asking how they can engage in activism, I guess, be more brave in the context of facing authoritarianism in a different context outside of Canada. So one question about effective pressure to the university, and another one is being brave in the face of authoritarianism.
Social media, he cried the old bass player from the corner. Social media is just the most important factor in any of this. Word of mouth ain't going to cut it. You know, we can't communicate with cleft sticks with pieces of paper in them running over mountaintops. So this is how we do it. This webinar is a very, very good example of how we spread the word and how succinct the word needs to be. I mean, somebody else should answer this question because it's specifically for universities and how they should do it. But this is the way that we communicate one with another across international borders and across international barriers with people in other universities in other places, so that we can talk to Chinese brothers and sisters in university in Beijing about this, because it is a global phenomena to wrest back power from the principals of universities and the deans and the boards and the donors back into the hands of the people who are represented by the student body in the university is obviously a fundamentally important question. And it can only be accomplished by this, exactly what we're doing here today. So before we get to the end, I'd like to thank you all, you know, particularly, I've forgotten your name again, but with the headphones on, who I interrupted earlier, for which I apologize.
Yes,
This has been a very, very interesting conversation for me. I've learned a lot about different universities in Canada and what you're all doing, and I'm deeply impressed by it. And I just want to sit here quietly in the corner and encourage you all. And because when you were talking a few minutes ago about anti-Semitism and how I loved the professor saying, well, what you do is you ask them the question of, what do you mean by anti-Semitism and which definition are you using and so on, and put them on that spot, because obviously at the opposition to what we're hoping for, which is universal human rights for all our brothers and sisters, they use the word anti-Semitism as a sort of coverall bludgeon, and they don't want you to look into what it actually means. This all started, 5 years ago now, before the 2019 election in the United Kingdom, where they were trying and succeeded in getting rid of Jeremy Corbyn as the leader of the Labour Party by introducing the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism to the Labour conference. And Jeremy Corbyn did not stand up against it. He allowed it to be passed and accepted. That was the beginning of the end, I think, for Corbyn, because he lost the faith of his followers that he might be able to stand up against the accusations of anti-Semitism that will be. I know I'm meandering a bit, but so you have to stand up. Obviously, you have to stand up to it. But I think to ask for their definition is a good way of going about it. Yeah. What's your definition? Because you immediately then get down to, do you support this genocide or not? Which is an extrapolation from, do you support human rights or not? Do you believe people should? Because if you do, you cannot be anything but 1000% against the state of Israel, because it obviously doesn't. And it's killing everybody in Palestine to prove that point. Exactly. We don't care about their rights. We want their stuff. That's the end of the story. And if you don't like that, yeah, join the students at McGill or TMU or whoever or wherever, because they are standing up against this genocide. And that is the central point to this webinar. That is the most important thing, is to stand with Bassam every minute of every day, every breath that we take, for the rest of our lives, until Palestine is free. From the river to the sea. There, he said it again. Yes, I did, Sylvan, you prick. Sorry, I've stopped now. I'm going to sit in the corner again. But thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us. So just to, again, Carleton University Radio is asking, where do we start? Is it letter campaigns? If so, who do we write to? How do they start at Carleton University to apply pressure?
Well, just one thought. I think it's important, like the phrasing of the question is actually really important. The question is about pressure specifically. And the reason why I emphasize that is because in the investigation against the TMU students, while they were exonerated, there's a portion of the investigators' report which criticizes their like rhetoric, their art of persuasion, and how they should have written a more civil letter. And I actually think this is a total category error. This is the investigator not understanding that you are not going to get divestment through persuasion. These institutions are deeply committed to Israel and to Zionism, and you get them to change policy through demands, through protest, through disruption. And I think that's really important. So this is like theoretically maybe helpful, but not practically. Like the different pressure points, I think you do need the details of different institutions to know where their pressure is, but I do think they need to be pressured specifically. I don't think you're going to persuade these institutions away from their complicity in genocide. If the genocide has not persuaded them to end complicity, then surely your letter will not, right? Like, the argument is overwhelming in context already. And so I think you need to find the pressure points of the institution and press those.
Absolutely. And knowing universities, if you approach this, whatever civility might mean, they're just going to hire a dean of civility next to investigate. It's going to be 5 years of funding hemorrhaging, and it'll go nowhere. But what about you, Yasmin? What about you, Jay, Nikita, Zach? What is pressure in your experience? What is this pressure?
Yeah, I can speak broadly. I mean, I think when it comes to campuses where a broad base doesn't exist, it is really hard to, I guess, mobilize in a really confrontational way. So I guess it's just start small, do the awareness raising campaigns, even if they're not necessarily fun or interesting. And if you can't afford it, always do apply a diversity of tactics, because there really is a lot of fault in honing in too much on institutional mobilizing or direct action mobilizing. But with applying both when they make sense and building a narrative around both is really going to help you build a bigger base and apply pressure sustainably. I'd say, yeah, that would be my advice. I also do need to leave to support what's going on the ground right now, but I just wanted to take a moment to thank everyone. This was really great, and hope to speak soon. Sorry, this is a bit abrupt, but
no, we should be
wrapping
up soon, but in solidarity with you and your comrades in Quebec, and we really hope what you're doing there is, has the effect of echoing across our campuses. So we're with you in solidarity with Palestine.
All right, see you guys soon. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Nikita and Zach and Jay, I want to give you an opportunity to comment before we wrap it up here.
I gotta. Oh, sorry. You go first, Jay.
Okay, really quick. I'll just cut in. I was gonna add kind of to maybe answer a little bit what Josh was saying, because there is this theoretical gap where it's protesting works, but then there's always the question of how do we get, and this relates to another question earlier, how do we get more people involved in movements? Because movements can become, usually they have a big moment like last year, but then they gradually shrink, and the question becomes long term, how do we grow a movement? And I think fundamentally one of the most true and tried techniques of organizing across the world is to, one, go figure out who in your communities is working class, disenfranchised, unhoused. Work with those people to meet their needs and give them political education. So social media, I agree with with Roger, can be part of the process of giving people political education, which gets them in the movement sometimes. But then we also need to bring in people who can't even access social media or can't go to university, because we do need to break those divides between the more affluent class of people, of which all of us are if we can afford to go to a university, and the working class and unhoused people. All these struggles are interrelated, and we do need to make sure it's a lot of work to give, especially people you may not immediately agree with, but you need to remember that you probably were always not as politically educated as you are. So you need to find a way to meet some needs that these people have so that you can be in community with them and then exchange political education and work towards building a movement. Unfortunately, this takes a lot of time, but this is lifelong work, right? Being involved in any kind of resistance and liberation movement is a lifelong commitment. It's not something you do till you graduate and then go work at a bank or whatever. So I just wanted to throw in my thoughts on that. Maybe there's a touch of praxis to Josh's theory.
Thank you, Jay.
Yeah, I love everything Jay just said. I was going to touch on some of that as well. I would just add that in terms of the universities themselves, like they're creatures of the government to a large extent. And, in BC, part of the context of organizing out here is that the minister, I believe her name was Robinson, did a tour of the universities up here and basically sounds like she was intimidating every single administration behind closed doors. And she was a little bit too ham-fisted about it, so it became a whole thing and she had to step down. But the government has not walked back any of that rhetoric. They got rid of her because she was too awkward about it, but they haven't changed any positions. So, like the same posture of exterminism that government institutions have taken with indigenous peoples, that it's part of the system. It's part of the way that it's structured. And I just want to highlight a couple weeks ago, Jason Hickel was on a panel, and he was talking about economic liberation of the global South is a direct threat to our systems and the way that our governments operate and the way that they pull their power and their money. And so a liberated Palestine means a liberated Middle East. If they can't keep Palestine down, they can't keep anybody down. So if we're going to continue to see these crazy, violent sort of backlashes against any efforts to support Palestine, and unfortunately, the institutions that come from the government, like universities, are very likely going to continue to be part of that. And we just have to be sort of, like Jay said, it's lifelong work.
Mhm. Nikita?
I think everyone's already really touched on a lot of the important parts of like how we've been organizing and the effective strategies. I really liked Josh's description of like asking clear questions. And he was talking about that more in response to like defense of things, but even as an offensive strategy, like asking really clear, simple questions as part of your information gathering, because really what the universities are doing is so ugly. And if we can gather that information effectively without them being able to PR dazzle around it and expose it, then that's, I think, a really effective strategy. And whether that's through access to information requests, or it's through showing up at offices, which we found really, really effective because it doesn't give them the opportunity to answer the questions really skillfully and to obfuscate. Being able to show up and say, hey, where are the scholarships you promised for Palestinian students? Number one. Number two, where did the $75,000 in scholarships you gave to Ukrainian students come from if you don't have it for Palestinian students? Number three, how do you explain this discrepancy? And you just give them very clear, simple questions that they can't dance around. And it just exposes how ugly what they're really doing is and how biased they really are. I think there was a separate part of your question that we didn't get to about how do we like stand up to this repression, especially the police repression. And I think for me and the students at Mon, it really is just about perspective. Like, how are we going to run away when the police show up, when we see what's happening in Palestine and we see the resilience of the Palestinian people? And then what is the alternative? We run away and we go home and we do life as normal in accepting that we live in a world where this is okay. I don't want to live in that world, so I have no option but to keep fighting, because that's not the world I want to live in. And the things that we have faced in response to that are so small in comparison to what's happening to the Palestinian people. So it's just about having perspective.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. We were out of time, so I would like to thank everyone for joining us. Please stay tuned for future webinars, future activism, and thank you very much, Roger, for using your mass platform and advocating for Palestinians, but also amplifying the activism of what our students here in Canada are doing. Have a great rest of the week, everyone, and take care.